The conference room felt like an icebox as I sat across from David, my husband of 8 years, watching him deliver the news that would change everything. His words echoed in my head like a broken record. Rachel, effective immediately, your services are no longer required at Morgan Digital Solutions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The smirk on Amanda Foster's face beside him told me everything. I needed to know about who was really behind this decision. What David didn't realize was that the folder I was clutching contained documents that would wipe that smirk off both their faces forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in our Portland home. I'd made coffee in our familiar kitchen, kissed the twins goodbye as they headed off to school, and driven to the downtown office building where we'd built our digital marketing empire together. Morgan Digital Solutions wasn't just a company to me. It was 5 years of 18-hour days, missed family dinners, and sacrificed weekends. It was my vision, my creativity, and my relentless determination wrapped up in a brand that had become Portland's go-to marketing firm for healthcare companies. But sitting in that sterile conference room, watching my husband's cold expression as he terminated my employment, I realized that everything I thought I knew about our partnership was about to unravel in the most spectacular way possible. The story really begins 6 months earlier, when the first crack appeared in what I thought was our perfect life. I remember the exact moment because it was so ordinary, so mundane, that the significance didn't hit me until much later. I was organizing our home office, trying to create some semblance of order in the chaos of running both a business and a household with twin 12-year-old boys. Alex and Jake were typical preteens, leaving trails of soccer cleats and homework assignments everywhere they went, and David had been working late more frequently, claiming that our biggest client was demanding around-the-clock attention. That evening, as I sorted through the stack of mail and business documents that had accumulated on David's desk, I found a letter from our business insurance company. The envelope was addressed to David Morgan, President and CEO of Morgan Digital Solutions. The title stopped me cold. President and CEO? We'd always been co-founders, equal partners in everything we'd built. When had that changed? I opened the letter with trembling fingers, scanning the contents about policy renewals and coverage updates. Every reference was to David as the sole owner and decision-maker for the company. My name appeared nowhere in the document, as if I'd never existed in the business we'd created together in our spare bedroom 5 years ago. The memory of those early days came flooding back. David had been working as a mid-level marketing coordinator for a healthcare nonprofit, while I freelanced as a graphic designer from home to have flexibility with the boys. We'd met at a community college business class, both of us dreaming of something bigger than our day jobs. The idea for Morgan Digital Solutions had actually been mine. I'd noticed how poorly most medical practices and healthcare companies handled their online presence, and I knew we could do better. Those first months were a blur of late nights and early mornings. While David handled client calls and business development, I designed websites, created marketing materials, and managed our social media accounts. We were a team in every sense of the word, splitting responsibilities based on our strengths rather than traditional gender roles. When our first major client, a chain of urgent care centers, signed a 6-figure annual contract, we celebrated by taking the boys to Chuck E. Cheese and talking about our dreams for the future. The business grew faster than we'd ever imagined. Within 2 years, we'd moved from our spare bedroom to a small office space in Southeast Portland. By year 3, we'd outgrown that space and relocated to a prestigious downtown building with views of the Willamette River. We hired our first employees, invested in cutting-edge technology, and landed contracts with some of the region's most prominent healthcare organizations. Throughout it all, I'd assumed we were building something, together, The business cards read, Morgan Digital Solutions, using our shared last name. The company logo incorporated design elements I'd created. Our marketing materials featured both our photos and bios, positioning us as the husband and wife team that understood both the creative and business sides of digital marketing. But apparently, while I was focused on the day-to-day operations of growing our company, David had been making changes I knew nothing about. Legal changes, structural changes that would allow him to erase me from the narrative entirely. The insurance letter was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to the business documents that crossed my desk. Invoices were addressed to David alone. Vendor contracts listed him as the sole authorized signatory. Even our bank statements showed him as the primary account holder, with my name relegated to a secondary authorization that could be revoked at any time. I tried to convince myself there were logical explanations. Maybe the insurance company had made an error. Perhaps David had simplified the business structure for tax purposes and forgotten to mention it. We'd always handled different aspects of the business. He focused on sales and client relationships while I managed the creative and operational sides. It was possible that legal documents had simply defaulted to listing him as the primary contact, but the nagging feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. I started watching David more carefully, noticing things I'd previously dismissed as normal business behavior. The way he closed his laptop when I entered his office, the hushed phone calls that ended abruptly when I came within earshot, the weekend meetings that he claimed were necessary but never seemed to result in new business. Most troubling was his relationship with Amanda Foster, our newest hire. Amanda had joined the company 6 months earlier as a business development specialist, coming to us with an impressive resume and references from several high-profile marketing firms. She was smart, ambitious, and undeniably attractive, with the kind of polished professionalism that impressed clients and commanded respect in boardroom meetings. At first, I'd been thrilled to have another strong woman on our team. Amanda seemed to understand the healthcare industry in ways that complemented my creative background, and her sales numbers were impressive from day one. She landed 3 major contracts in her first month, including a prestigious partnership with Oregon Health and Science University that we'd been pursuing for over a year. But as the weeks went by, I noticed that Amanda's successes were increasingly attributed to David's leadership rather than her individual contributions. In client meetings, David would present strategies and concepts that I'd developed, with Amanda nodding along and adding supporting details. When local business publications featured articles about Morgan Digital Solutions, the interviews focused on David's vision and Amanda's execution, while my role was minimized to creative support and behind-the-scenes operations. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. I was being written out of my own company's story, replaced by a younger, more polished version of professional success. Amanda dressed impeccably, spoke with confidence about industry trends, and seemed to anticipate David's needs before he expressed them. She was everything I'd been too busy to become while managing the actual work of building our business. Their relationship extended beyond normal business hours. Amanda would stay late for strategy sessions that often lasted until well past dinner time. She accompanied David to industry conferences and networking events, opportunities that had previously been mine. When clients called the office, they increasingly asked to speak with David or Amanda, treating me as an intermediary rather than a decision-maker. I tried to address my concerns directly with David, choosing a quiet evening after the boys had gone to bed. We were sitting in our living room, the same space where we'd once planned our business dreams, and I attempted to broach the subject carefully. "I've been thinking about our roles at the company," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "It seems like the business structure might need some clarification. I noticed that a lot of our official documents only list you as the owner." David barely looked up from his tablet. "It's just simpler that way for legal purposes. You know how complicated business partnerships can get." But we are partners, right? I mean, legally and financially? He finally met my gaze, and something in his expression made my stomach tighten. Of course we're partners, Rachel. We're married. What's mine is yours. You know that. His answer was technically correct, but felt evasive. Marriage didn't automatically confer business ownership, and his deflection suggested he knew that, as well as I did. I pressed a little further. Maybe we should schedule a meeting with our lawyer to review the corporate structure. Make sure everything is properly documented. That's not necessary, David replied, his tone becoming slightly sharp. Our lawyer set everything up correctly from the beginning. You're worrying about nothing. But I wasn't worrying about nothing, and deep down, David knew it. The conversation ended there, but it marked the beginning of a new awareness for me. I started documenting things differently, paying attention to details I'd previously taken for granted. I created copies of important documents and stored them in a personal file at home. I began keeping a record of my contributions to major projects, including timestamps and email threads that showed my involvement. Most importantly, I started questioning assumptions I'd held for years about our partnership, our marriage, and the future we were supposedly building together. The woman who had co-founded Morgan Digital Solutions was still there, buried under years of domestic responsibilities and business growth. But she was waking up, and she was starting to get angry. The real turning point came during a client presentation that should have been routine. We were pitching a comprehensive digital marketing overhaul to Pacific Northwest Medical Group, a network of specialty practices that represented potentially our largest contract to date. I'd spent weeks developing the creative strategy, designing mock-ups, and preparing detailed implementation timelines. The presentation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in our main conference room. I arrived early to set up the materials and test the technology, wanting everything to be perfect. David and Amanda arrived together, which wasn't unusual. They'd been carpooling to early meetings more frequently. But something about their body language, the way they moved in sync, and finished each other's sentences, set off alarm bells in my head. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During the presentation, I watched in disbelief as David presented my creative concepts as collaborative efforts between him and Amanda. Designs I'd created from scratch were described as Amanda's vision brought to life by our creative team. Strategic recommendations I'd developed through months of industry research were attributed to David and Amanda's market analysis. When the clients asked specific questions about implementation timelines and technical requirements, areas where I had the most expertise, David deflected to Amanda, who provided vague responses that sounded impressive but lacked substance. I tried to interject with more detailed information, but David smoothly redirected the conversation back to high-level strategy discussions. The meeting ended with handshakes and promises to follow up within a week. The client seemed impressed, and I knew we had a strong chance of landing the contract. But instead of feeling triumphant, I felt invisible. My contributions had been minimized, my expertise dismissed, and my role reduced to that of a silent observer in my own company. After the clients left, David and Amanda retreated to his office for what they called a debrief session. I wasn't invited to join them, despite having been the primary architect of the presentation they'd just delivered. I sat in my own office, staring at my computer screen and trying to process what had just happened. That evening, I did something I'd never done before in our 8 years of marriage. I went through David's personal belongings. I waited until he was in the shower, then quietly opened his briefcase and examined the contents. Most of it was routine, business documents and meeting notes, but buried beneath a stack of contracts was a folder that made my blood run cold. Inside were incorporation papers for Morgan Digital Solutions that I'd never seen before. Documents that listed David Morgan as the sole owner and president of the company. Articles of incorporation dated 2 years ago, long after we'd supposedly established the business as equal partners. And most damning of all, a signature page that appeared to bear my forged signature, authorizing the transfer of my ownership stake to David. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands shaking. As I tried to keep the camera steady, the implications were staggering. Not only had David systematically erased me from our company's legal structure, but he'd apparently forged my signature to make it appear consensual. The business we'd built together, the source of our family's financial security, had been stolen from me through deliberate fraud. But even as the evidence mounted, I wasn't prepared for how brazen David's final move would be. The termination meeting came without warning, scheduled for a Tuesday morning under the pretense of discussing operational efficiency. I walked into that conference room expecting a routine business discussion, and instead found myself facing the end of everything I'd worked to build. David's words were clinical, professional, and devastating. "Rachel, we've made the difficult decision to restructure the company's leadership team. Your position is being eliminated effective immediately. Amanda will be taking over your responsibilities as Chief Creative Officer." The title he'd given Amanda was one I'd never officially held, but had essentially been performing for years. Chief Creative Officer, the role that encompassed everything I'd contributed to the company's success, was being handed to the woman who'd been systematically replacing me for months. "This is a business decision," David continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "We need to streamline operations and focus on our core competencies. Amanda's background is better aligned with our current market position." I stared at him across the conference table, this man I'd married, the father of my children, the person I'd trusted with my dreams and my future. Amanda sat beside him, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes bright with barely concealed satisfaction. This wasn't just a business decision. It was a carefully orchestrated betrayal that had been months in the making. "What about my ownership stake in the company?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. David and Amanda exchanged a quick glance before he responded. "Rachel, I think you're confused about the business structure. You've been an employee, not an owner. A very valued employee, but the company has always been my venture." The lie was so audacious, so completely contradictory to our shared history, that I almost laughed. But then I remembered the documents in my purse, the evidence I'd been gathering, and the folder that contained information they couldn't possibly imagine I possessed. "I see," I said quietly, standing up from the conference table. "In that case, I suppose there's nothing left to discuss." As I walked toward the door, Amanda finally spoke. "Rachel, I want you to know that this isn't personal. It's just business." I turned back to look at her, this woman who'd infiltrated my company and my marriage with surgical precision. "Amanda, everything is personal. You'll learn that soon. Enough." The smirk on her face suggested she thought I was just another discarded wife making empty threats. David's expression was equally dismissive, as if I were a minor inconvenience he'd finally managed to eliminate. Neither of them understood that I hadn't been sitting idle during those months of gradual marginalization. I'd been preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, and building a case that would soon turn their victory into their downfall. As I left the conference room for what I thought might be the last time, I clutched the folder in my purse a little tighter. Inside were documents that would change everything, including the one piece of evidence that would expose their carefully constructed fraud for what it truly was. The real ownership papers for Morgan Digital Solutions, the ones that told a very different story about who actually controlled the company they thought they'd stolen from me. David and Amanda had no idea that their betrayal was about to become their destruction. But they were about to learn a lesson about underestimating the woman who'd built everything they thought they now owned. The drive home from the office felt surreal, like I was moving through someone else's life. Portland's familiar streets blurred past my windshield as I processed what had just happened. 8 years of marriage, 5 years of building a business together, and it had all been dismantled in a 20-minute meeting. But as I pulled into our driveway in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, looking at the craftsman-style house we'd bought with the profits from our first major contract, I felt something unexpected settling in my chest. Not despair, not even anger, but a cold, calculating determination. The house was empty, Alex and Jake still at school for another few hours. I walked through the rooms we'd furnished together, past family photos that now seemed like evidence of an elaborate charade. In David's home office, I sat down at his desk and opened my laptop. If David thought he could erase me from our company, with forged documents and corporate restructuring, he was about to discover just how wrong he could be. My first call was to Lisa Hayes, the most aggressive divorce attorney in Portland. I'd researched her months ago when the insurance letter first raised my suspicions, though I'd hoped I'd never need her services. Lisa's reputation preceded her. She was known for taking on powerful men who thought they could manipulate the system and leaving them with nothing but legal bills and public humiliation. Lisa's office was in the Pearl District, a sleek space that projected confidence and success. She was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with sharp eyes and an even sharper suit. When I explained my situation, she listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad. "Let me understand this correctly," she said when I finished. "Your husband terminated your employment from a company you believe you co-own, and you suspect he's forged documents to transfer your ownership stake to himself?" I nodded, pulling out my phone to show her the photographs I'd taken of the incorporation papers. Lisa studied each image carefully, her expression growing more serious with each swipe. "These signatures are clearly forged," she said finally. "The pressure points are wrong, and the letter formation is inconsistent with your natural handwriting samples on these other documents. But Rachel, proving forgery is just the beginning. We need to establish what your legitimate ownership stake actually is." That's when I told her about the safety deposit box. I'd opened the box 3 years ago, shortly after we'd moved to the downtown office. At the time, it had seemed like a practical precaution, a place to store important documents and backup files in case something happened to our office. David knew about the box, but what he didn't know was that I'd been systematically documenting our business relationship since the very beginning. The next morning, Lisa and I met at First National Bank on Southwest Morrison. The safety deposit box was larger than most, packed with manila folders that contained 5 years of meticulous record-keeping, business plans written in my handwriting, email printouts showing my creative contributions to major projects, financial records documenting my initial investment in the company, and most importantly, the original partnership agreement we'd drafted in our spare bedroom, signed by both of us and notarized by David's college friend who'd just passed the bar exam. Lisa's eyes lit up as she examined the documents. "This is a gold mine, Rachel. Not only do these papers establish your legitimate 50% ownership of the company, but they also show a clear pattern of your contributions to its growth and success." But the real bombshell was in the last folder I pulled from the box. It contained the original LLC filing documents for Morgan Digital Solutions, papers I'd personally submitted to the Oregon Secretary of State's office 5 years ago. The documents listed Rachel Morgan as the registered agent and primary member of the limited liability company, with David Morgan as a secondary member. "Wait," Lisa said, studying the papers more carefully. "According to these filings, you're not just a 50% owner. You're the majority stakeholder and the legally designated manager of the LLC." The implications hit me like a physical force. All those months of feeling marginalized and pushed aside, of watching David and Amanda take credit for my work, it had all been built on a foundation of lies. Not only was I an equal partner in Morgan Digital Solutions, I was actually the controlling member of the company. David couldn't legally terminate my employment because, according to the state of Oregon, I was his boss. Lisa was already making phone calls, her voice crisp and professional as she spoke with her paralegal. I need you to run a corporate records search on Morgan Digital Solutions immediately. Cross-reference with the Secretary of State's database, and pull all filing histories for the past 5 years. While we waited for the search results, Lisa explained my options. We can file for an emergency injunction to prevent any further corporate actions without your approval. We can also pursue criminal charges for the document forgery and potentially fraud. But Rachel, I think there's a more elegant solution here. The corporate records search confirmed what we already suspected. The original LLC documents were still on file with the state, never legally superseded by the fraudulent papers David had created. In the eyes of Oregon law, I remained the primary manager and majority owner of Morgan Digital Solutions. David's termination of my employment was not only invalid, it was corporate malfeasance. Here's what we're going to do, Lisa said, spreading the documents across her conference table. We're going to let David and Amanda think they've won for a few more days while we prepare our counterattack. When we move, it needs to be swift and comprehensive. The waiting was torture. I maintained normal routines at home, helping the boys with homework and preparing dinner as if nothing had changed. David came home that evening with flowers and an expensive bottle of wine, playing the role of the supportive husband consoling his recently unemployed wife. I know this is difficult, he said over dinner, his voice full of manufactured sympathy. But maybe this is an opportunity for you to explore other interests. You've always talked about going back to freelance design work. Alex and Jake looked between us with concern, sensing the tension they couldn't quite understand. Is Mom really not working at the company anymore? Jake asked. Sometimes grown-ups make changes to their jobs, David replied smoothly. Mom's going to have more time to spend with you guys now. I smiled and nodded, playing along with his narrative while mentally cataloging every patronizing word. He had no idea that his attempt to comfort his supposedly defeated wife was being recorded on my phone, adding to the growing collection of evidence that would soon destroy him. The next few days revealed the true scope of David and Amanda's plans. Through contacts still working at the company, employees who were confused and upset by my sudden departure, I learned that they were moving quickly to consolidate power. Amanda had already moved into the corner office that had been mine, and she was scheduling meetings with our biggest clients to introduce herself as the new creative director. More troubling were the financial changes happening behind the scenes. According to Maria Santos, our longtime office manager who'd remained loyal to me, David was transferring money from the company's operating accounts to a new consulting firm called Foster Solutions. When Maria looked up the business registration, she discovered that Foster Solutions was owned entirely by Amanda, created just 2 weeks before my termination. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't just about pushing me out of the company, it was about systematically looting the business we'd built together and transferring those assets to Amanda's control. David and Amanda weren't just having an affair, they were committing corporate fraud on a massive scale. Lisa's investigation uncovered even more disturbing details. The contracts Amanda had supposedly landed through her impressive sales skills were actually renewals of existing client relationships I'd cultivated over years. She'd simply inserted herself into ongoing negotiations and claimed credit for their successful completion. The Oregon Health and Science University partnership she'd been celebrated for closing was based on a proposal I'd written 6 months before she even joined the company. This is textbook fraud, Lisa explained during one of our strategy sessions. They're not just stealing your ownership stake. They're rewriting the entire history of the company to justify their actions. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Kevin Walsh, the private investigator Lisa had hired to document David and Amanda's relationship, returned with photographs and financial records that painted a picture of betrayal, far more extensive than I'd imagined. David and Amanda had been planning this takeover for almost a year. Bank records showed that Amanda had been receiving payments from a shell company controlled by David months before she was officially hired. Hotel receipts and travel records documented business trips they'd taken together, supposedly for client development, that had actually been working vacations where they'd planned their strategy. Most damning of all were the recordings Kevin had obtained through a contact at a restaurant where David and Amanda frequently met for lunch. Their conversations, captured through sophisticated surveillance equipment, revealed the calculated nature of their betrayal. The key is making it look like a business decision rather than personal. Amanda's voice was clear on the recording. If we frame it as operational efficiency, Rachel won't have grounds to challenge the termination. David's response chilled me to the bone. She's been dead weight for months anyway. The company will be more profitable without her dragging down our margins. What about the kids? Amanda asked. They'll adjust. Children are resilient, and frankly, they'll be better off with a more successful father figure in their lives. The casual way they discussed dismantling my family, as if my children were just collateral damage in their corporate coup, transformed my cold determination into something much more dangerous. They hadn't just stolen my company, they'd planned to steal my entire life. Lisa and I spent the next week preparing what she called the nuclear option. We documented every fraudulent action, every forged signature, every transfer of assets that should have required my approval as the managing member of the LLC. We prepared criminal referrals for the district attorney's office and civil lawsuits that would not only restore my control of the company, but also seek damages for the emotional distress and financial harm they'd caused. But the centerpiece of our strategy was something much more immediate and devastating. Oregon law allowed the managing member of an LLC to call an emergency meeting of all stakeholders with just 24 hours' notice. As the legitimate controlling owner of Morgan Digital Solutions, I had the legal authority to convene such a meeting and make binding decisions about the company's future, including the termination of employees who had violated their fiduciary duties to the organization. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon in the main conference room of our downtown office. I sent the official notice through the company's legal counsel, bypassing David entirely. The message was simple and professional. Emergency LLC. Meeting. All stakeholders required to attend. Agenda. Corporate governance and personnel decisions. David called me within minutes of receiving the notice, his voice tight with confusion and barely controlled anger. Rachel, what is this about? You can't call company meetings. You don't work here anymore. I think you'll find that I have every legal right to call this meeting, I replied calmly. I'll see you Friday at 3 o'clock. The 2 days leading up to the meeting were tense. David made several attempts to get me to explain what I was planning, alternating between threats and attempts at reconciliation. Amanda, according to Maria, was frantically calling lawyers and trying to understand what authority I might still have within the company structure. They were about to find out. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of gray, drizzly weather that made Portland famous. I dressed carefully for the occasion, a navy blue power suit that projected authority and confidence. Lisa met me in the building lobby, carrying a briefcase full of evidence and legal documents. As we rode the elevator to the 8th floor, I thought about all the times I'd made this same journey over the past 5 years. The excitement of our first major client meeting, the stress of quarterly reviews, the satisfaction of successful project launches. This building had been the site of so many professional triumphs and personal memories. Today, it would be the site of my resurrection. The conference room was full when we arrived. David sat at the head of the table, Amanda beside him, both of them radiating false confidence. Several employees had been asked to attend as witnesses, including Maria, who gave me an encouraging nod. 2 additional people I didn't recognize sat near the back, presumably the lawyers David and Amanda had hastily retained. I took my seat at the opposite end of the table from David, Lisa beside me. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. This was clearly going to be a confrontation rather than a collaborative discussion. Thank you all for attending on short notice, I began, my voice steady and professional. I've called this meeting to address some serious irregularities in the management and operation of Morgan Digital Solutions. David leaned forward, his jaw tight. Rachel, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but you have no authority to— Actually, David, Lisa interrupted smoothly, Mrs. Morgan has every authority to conduct this meeting. As the managing member and majority owner of this limited liability company, she's not only entitled to call emergency meetings, but also to make binding decisions about corporate governance. The silence that followed was deafening. Amanda's face had gone pale, and David's lawyer was frantically shuffling through papers, clearly unprepared for this development. That's impossible, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm the owner of this company. I have the incorporation papers to prove it. Lisa smiled, the expression sharp as a blade. Mr. Morgan, the papers you're referring to contain forged signatures and fraudulent information. They have no legal standing whatsoever. She began distributing copies of the original LLC documents, the ones from my safety deposit box that established my controlling interest in the company. As the papers circulated around the table, I watched understanding dawn on the faces of everyone present. Furthermore, Lisa continued, we have evidence of systematic fraud, including the unauthorized transfer of company assets to entities controlled by Ms. Foster, the forgery of corporate documents, and the violation of fiduciary duties owed to the legitimate owner of this business. Amanda finally found her voice. This is ridiculous. David and I built this company together. Rachel was just an employee? I finished for her. That's interesting, Amanda, because according to these financial records, I've been the primary investor and creative force behind every major contract this company has ever secured. I stood up, walking to the whiteboard at the front of the room. Let me tell you what's going to happen. Effective immediately, David Morgan and Amanda Foster are terminated from all positions within Morgan Digital Solutions. Security will escort you from the building, and you have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings under supervision. David shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage. You can't do this. I'll fight you in court. You'll what? I asked calmly. Forge more documents? Transfer more company assets to your girlfriend's shell corporation? David, you've already committed enough felonies to put you in prison for the next decade. Lisa opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Mr. Morgan, these are criminal referrals we'll be filing with the district attorney's office on Monday morning. Wire fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and conspiracy charges. I'd strongly recommend you retain competent criminal counsel. The meeting concluded with David and Amanda being escorted from the building by security guards, their access to company systems immediately revoked. The employees who remained were stunned but supportive, many of them admitting they'd been uncomfortable with the sudden changes in leadership and were relieved to see me back in control. As I sat in my reclaimed office that evening, looking out at the Portland skyline, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. The company was mine again, legally and practically. David and Amanda's elaborate scheme had collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance and my careful preparation. But this was just the beginning. The real reckoning was still to come, and it would involve much more than just corporate control. It would involve the complete dismantling of the life David thought he could steal from me, piece by carefully planned piece. The weekend following David and Amanda's termination brought an eerie calm to our house in Laurelhurst. David had moved out Friday night, claiming he needed space to process what had happened, though I suspected he was actually meeting with lawyers to figure out how to salvage his situation. Alex and Jake knew something serious was happening, but didn't understand the full scope yet. I'd told them their father and I were having some business disagreements that might affect our living arrangements temporarily. What I didn't expect was the phone call I received Saturday morning from Tom Bradley, David's former business partner from his previous job. Tom had left the healthcare nonprofit where he and David worked 3 years ago, under circumstances that David had always described as creative differences. I'd liked Tom during the brief time I knew him. He was methodical, ethical, and had a reputation for thorough research. His call would prove to be the key that unlocked secrets I never could have imagined. "Rachel." Tom's voice was cautious. "Over the phone. I heard through mutual contacts that you and David are having some business troubles. I think we need to talk." We met that afternoon at a quiet coffee shop in Southeast Portland, away from downtown, where we might run into people from our professional circles. Tom looked older than I remembered, with deep lines around his eyes and a wariness that suggested he'd been carrying heavy knowledge for a long time. "What I'm about to tell you might be difficult to hear," he began, stirring his coffee slowly. "But I've been waiting 3 years for someone to ask the right questions about David's business practices." What Tom revealed over the next 2 hours fundamentally changed my understanding of who my husband really was. The creative differences that had led to his departure from the nonprofit weren't creative at all. They were ethical violations that Tom had discovered and reported to the board of directors. David was skimming money from client accounts, Tom explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Small amounts at first, maybe $500 or $1,000 from contracts worth $50,000 or $60,000. He was brilliant at it, actually. The accounting looked perfect on the surface. According to Tom, David had developed an elaborate system of creating phantom expenses and vendor payments that were actually being funneled into accounts he controlled. When Tom stumbled across discrepancies in a client's budget reconciliation, he'd spent weeks tracking the money trail before confronting David directly. "He denied everything at first," Tom continued. "Said I was misreading the financial reports, that the nonprofit's accounting systems were just confusing. But I had documentation, Rachel. Bank records, forged invoices, the whole scheme laid out in spreadsheets." The confrontation had escalated to the board level, but David's charm and professional reputation had served him well. He'd positioned Tom as a disgruntled employee making false accusations, while simultaneously announcing his intention to leave the nonprofit to start his own business. The board had been relieved to see the conflict resolved without a public scandal. "They let him resign quietly," Tom said bitterly. "No criminal charges, no public disclosure, just a clean departure and glowing references. I quit a month later because I couldn't stand working for an organization that would cover up fraud to protect their reputation." The timeline aligned perfectly with when David and I had founded Morgan Digital Solutions. The initial investment money that David claimed came from his savings had actually been stolen from his previous employer. Our entire business had been built on a foundation of embezzled funds. "Why didn't you report this to the police?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "I tried," Tom replied. "But without the nonprofit's cooperation, I didn't have enough evidence to make a criminal case. David was careful to destroy most of the documentation before he left, and the board wasn't interested in pursuing an investigation that would damage their reputation. But Tom had kept copies of everything he'd been able to gather: bank statements, email communications, and most importantly, a detailed analysis of David's embezzlement scheme that showed exactly how he'd stolen nearly $75,000 over an 18-month period. "I've held on to this information for 3 years, Tom said, sliding a flash drive across the table. "I always suspected David would eventually show his true colors again. When I heard about your situation, I knew it was time to speak up." The information on Tom's flash drive was devastating. Not only did it prove that David had a history of financial fraud, but it also revealed patterns of behavior that I could now see reflected in his treatment of Morgan Digital Solutions. The phantom expenses, the unauthorized transfers, the creation of shell companies. It was all exactly what he'd done at the nonprofit, just on a larger scale. That evening, I called Lisa Hayes to update her on Tom's revelations. Her response was immediate and energizing. "This is exactly what we needed," she said. "Pattern evidence of prior fraud makes our current case much stronger. But Rachel, if David stole money to start your business, there might be additional legal complications we need to address. The implications were staggering. If Morgan Digital Solutions had been funded with stolen money, every contract we'd signed, every employee we'd hired, every success we'd achieved was potentially tainted by David's original crime. But Lisa explained that my lack of knowledge about the source of the funds, combined with my legitimate contributions to the business, would likely protect my interests. The important thing is that we now have evidence of a pattern of criminal behavior spanning multiple years and multiple organizations, she said. This isn't just about your marriage or your business. This is about a serial fraudster who's been operating with impunity for years. Monday morning brought new revelations as I returned to the Morgan Digital Solutions office. Maria Santos had spent the weekend going through financial records that David and Amanda had left behind in their hasty departure. What she found painted an even more disturbing picture of their conspiracy. They weren't just stealing from the company, Maria explained, spreading printouts across my desk. They were systematically destroying relationships with our long-term clients to force them into new contracts with Amanda's consulting firm. The evidence was sophisticated and damning. David and Amanda had been deliberately sabotaging project timelines, creating communication breakdowns, and even introducing technical problems into client deliverables. When frustrated clients complained about service quality, Amanda would position herself as the solution, offering her new consulting firm as an alternative to the supposedly declining Morgan Digital Solutions. "Look at this," Maria said, pointing to a series of email exchanges. The Oregon Health and Science University contract that Amanda claimed credit for landing? She actually convinced them to cancel their existing agreement with us and sign a new deal with Foster Solutions for twice the price. I studied the documentation, my anger building with each page. They hadn't just planned to push me out of my own company. They'd been actively sabotaging the business to create opportunities for Amanda's competing firm. It was corporate warfare disguised as internal restructuring. But the most shocking discovery came when Maria showed me the backup files from Amanda's computer, which IT had recovered during the security lockdown. Hidden in a folder labeled Personal Documents were communications that revealed the true scope of their conspiracy. Amanda's emails with David dated back nearly 2 years, long before she'd officially joined Morgan Digital Solutions. The early messages were professionally cordial, but they quickly evolved into detailed discussions of business strategy that had nothing to do with her supposed role in business development. Target acquisition phase should be complete by Q3, read one email from Amanda to David. Once I'm established internally, we can begin the systematic restructuring. The key is making Rachel feel valued while gradually reducing her actual influence. Another message was even more explicit. The partnership dissolution needs to appear organic. If Rachel suspects she's being pushed out deliberately, she might fight back. Better to let her think she's choosing to step away from day-to-day operations. They'd been planning my professional assassination for almost 2 years, carefully orchestrating every move to ensure I'd be eliminated without realizing what was happening until it was too late. The termination meeting that had felt so sudden and shocking was actually the culmination of a patient, methodical campaign to steal everything I'd built. As I read through months of communications between David and Amanda, I began to understand that their relationship was far more complicated than a simple affair. Amanda wasn't just David's mistress. She was his business partner in a scheme that extended far beyond Morgan Digital Solutions. The emails revealed that Foster Solutions was just one component of a larger network of shell companies and consulting firms that David and Amanda had been creating together. They had plans to replicate their approach with other small businesses, targeting successful companies with vulnerable ownership structures. "It's actually quite brilliant," read one of Amanda's messages. "Small business owners, especially married couples, rarely have proper legal protections in place. A few forged documents, some strategic relationship building, and you can acquire established companies for a fraction of their actual value. I was just their first target, a proof of concept for a business model based on fraud and manipulation. They'd studied my marriage, identified my vulnerabilities, and exploited my trust to steal everything I'd worked to create. But more than that, they'd planned to use my company as a template for destroying other families and businesses. The realization that I was part of a larger criminal enterprise rather than just a personal betrayal changed everything. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about preventing David and Amanda from destroying other people's lives the way they'd tried to destroy mine. Lisa's reaction to the new evidence was swift and decisive. "We're not just dealing with fraud anymore," she said during an emergency meeting Tuesday morning. "This is organized crime. We need to involve federal authorities." She'd already been in contact with the FBI's white-collar crime division, and the agent assigned to the case was eager to review our documentation. Agent Sarah Chen had been investigating a series of similar business takeovers across the Pacific Northwest, and our evidence might be the key to connecting a pattern of crimes spanning multiple states. Agent Chen was impressive, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, and clearly experienced in complex financial investigations. When we met at the FBI field office Tuesday afternoon, she listened to our presentation with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what she was hearing. "The methodology you're describing matches cases we've been tracking in Seattle, Spokane, and Boise," she said, studying the timeline we'd prepared. "Small businesses with husband and wife ownership, infiltration by attractive new employees, systematic asset transfer, and partnership dissolution. We suspected there was a coordinated effort, but we haven't had evidence linking the different incidents." Agent Chen explained that the FBI had been monitoring similar cases for 18 months, but the perpetrators had been careful to avoid crossing state lines in ways that would clearly establish federal jurisdiction. Our case was different because David and Amanda's shell company network involved banks and business registrations in multiple states. "If we can prove this is part of an interstate conspiracy," Agent Chen said, "we can bring federal charges that carry much more serious penalties than state-level fraud." The investigation moved quickly after that. Agent Chen's team obtained warrants for David and Amanda's financial records, phone communications, and computer files. What they found confirmed our worst suspicions and revealed crimes far more extensive than we'd imagined. David and Amanda were part of a network of at least 8 people operating across 5 states. They'd successfully taken over 12 businesses in the past 3 years, stealing millions of dollars in assets and destroying dozens of families in the process. The scheme was sophisticated, well-funded, and remarkably successful, until they'd targeted someone who fought back. The other victims were heartbreaking to learn about. A restaurant chain in Seattle where the husband had been convinced to sign over ownership to his supposed business partner, only to be terminated and left with massive debt. A construction company in Boise where the wife had been gradually pushed out of management decisions until she discovered her husband was planning to divorce her and claim sole ownership of the business they'd built together. Each case followed the same pattern: infiltration, manipulation, documentation fraud, and ultimately the complete transfer of assets to the criminal network. The victims were left financially devastated, emotionally destroyed, and often too ashamed to pursue legal action against people they'd trusted completely. "The psychological manipulation is as sophisticated as the financial fraud," Agent Chen explained. "They target people's deepest vulnerabilities: their marriages, their trust in their partners, their sense of identity tied to their businesses. By the time victims realize what's happening, they're often too emotionally devastated to mount effective resistance. But I hadn't been too devastated to fight back, and now the entire criminal network was about to face the consequences of underestimating one very angry woman who'd kept excellent records. Wednesday morning brought news that would make everything that had happened seem almost trivial by comparison. Agent Chen called me at home, her voice tight with excitement and concern. "Rachel, we need to meet immediately. The investigation has uncovered something that changes everything about your case." When I arrived at the FBI field office, Agent Chen led me to a secure conference room where she'd spread out financial documents, photographs, and what appeared to be surveillance reports. "We've been analyzing the communications we seized from David and Amanda's computers," she began. "What we found suggests that your situation is even more complicated than we initially thought." She handed me a series of printed emails between Amanda and someone identified only as MR. The messages were cryptic, but clearly referenced ongoing surveillance of my activities, detailed knowledge of my daily routines, and specific information about my children's schedules. "Rachel," Agent Chen said quietly, "how long have you been aware that you were being followed?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "I wasn't aware," I replied, my voice barely steady. "Are you saying someone's been watching me?" Agent Chen nodded grimly. "For at least 6 months, according to these communications. Professional surveillance, not just casual observation. They knew where you went, who you talked to, what you did every day. This wasn't just about stealing your business, Rachel. They were monitoring your every move." The implications were terrifying. While I'd been investigating David and Amanda's fraud, they'd been watching me investigate them. Every meeting with Lisa, every conversation with Tom Bradley, every piece of evidence I'd gathered, they'd known about all of it. "Why didn't they try to stop me?" I asked. Agent Chen's expression was grim. "Because they thought they could use your investigation against you. Look at this." She showed me a series of communications between Amanda and the mysterious M. Ari that outlined a plan to frame me for the very crimes David and Amanda had committed. They'd been preparing to claim that I was the one who'd forged documents, embezzled money, and destroyed the business, using my own investigation as evidence of my supposed guilt. "They were going to let you gather all the evidence," Agent Chen explained, "then claim you'd created it to cover up your own crimes. It's actually quite brilliant in a sociopathic way. Who better to frame for business fraud than the person who discovers the business fraud?" But their plan had a fatal flaw. They'd underestimated the quality of my documentation and the extent of Agent Chen's investigation. The evidence I'd gathered was genuine, verifiable, and supported by independent sources they couldn't have manipulated. More importantly, the FBI's broader investigation had uncovered communications and financial records that proved David and Amanda's criminal network had been operating long before I'd ever suspected anything was wrong. They couldn't claim I was the mastermind of a conspiracy that predated my awareness of the conspiracy's existence. "We're ready to move," Agent Chen announced. "Tomorrow morning, we'll be executing arrest warrants for David, Amanda, and 6 other members of their network. This is going to be one of the largest business fraud cases prosecuted in the Pacific Northwest in the past decade." As I drove home that evening, I thought about the past months of discovery, investigation, and preparation. What had started as a simple business dispute had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous than I'd ever imagined. David hadn't just betrayed our marriage or stolen our company. He'd been part of a criminal enterprise that had destroyed dozens of lives across multiple states. But tomorrow, that enterprise would begin to crumble. And I would finally have the justice that had seemed impossible just a few months earlier, when I'd sat in that conference room listening to my husband fire me from my own company. The reckoning was about to begin, and it would be far more comprehensive than David and Amanda could possibly have anticipated. The morning of the arrests dawned crisp and clear, one of those perfect Portland days when Mount Hood was visible from downtown, and the city seemed to sparkle with possibility. I stood in my kitchen making coffee for Alex and Jake, maintaining the routine of normalcy while knowing that everything was about to change forever. Agent Chen had called at 6 a.m. to confirm that the operations were proceeding as planned across 5 states, with coordinated arrests happening simultaneously, to prevent any members of the network from warning the others. At 7:30, just as the boys were finishing their breakfast, I heard the unmistakable sound of multiple vehicles pulling into our driveway. Through the front window, I could see black SUVs and unmarked sedans, their occupants moving with the purposeful efficiency of federal agents executing a carefully planned operation. Alex and Jake looked at me with wide eyes, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. "Boys, I need you to go to your rooms. For a little while," I said calmly. "Some police officers need to talk to Daddy about his work, and it might be confusing for you to hear." They complied without argument, though I could see Jake lingering at the top of the stairs, trying to catch glimpses of what was happening below. The doorbell rang exactly 3 times, and I opened it to find Agent Chen flanked by 4 other federal agents, their badges prominently displayed. "Mrs. Morgan," Agent Chen said formally, "we have a warrant for the arrest of David Michael Morgan. Is he currently in the residence?" "He's in his home office," I replied, stepping aside to let them enter. "Down the hall, last door on the left." What followed was swift and professional. The agents moved through the house with practiced efficiency, their voices calm but authoritative as they announced themselves and read David his rights. I heard his voice rise in anger and confusion, followed by the measured responses of the arresting officers explaining the charges against him. When they brought David through the living room in handcuffs, his eyes found mine across the space. For a moment, I saw not the manipulative criminal he'd revealed himself to be, but the man I'd married 8 years ago, the father of my children, the person I'd trusted with my dreams and my future. Then his expression hardened into something ugly and accusatory. "This is your doing," he said, his voice carrying a venom I'd never heard before. "You vindictive witch. You're destroying our family over a business disagreement." Agent Chen stepped between us before I could respond. "Mr. Morgan, you're being arrested on federal charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. I suggest you save your statements for your attorney." As they led him away, David turned back one more time. "The boys will never forgive you for this, Rachel. Never." The words hit their intended target, sending a spike of doubt through my chest. But then I thought about all the other families David and Amanda had destroyed, all the children who'd watched their parents lose everything to these predators. And my resolve strengthened. My boys deserved to know the truth about their father, painful as it might be. The house felt strange after the agents left, as if the very air had changed composition. I called my sister Jennifer, who lived across town, and asked her to pick up Alex and Jake for the day. They needed to be away from the media attention that would inevitably follow, and I needed time to process what came next. Agent Chen had warned me that David's arrest was just the beginning of a complex legal process that could take months or even years to fully resolve. The federal charges carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in prison, but prosecuting a conspiracy case involving multiple defendants across multiple states would require extensive coordination and careful preparation. More immediately, I needed to deal with the fallout at Morgan Digital Solutions. Word of David's arrest had spread quickly through Portland's business community, and by noon my phone was ringing constantly with calls from clients, employees, and reporters wanting statements about the situation. Lisa Hayes arrived at my house that afternoon, carrying a stack of legal documents and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent the morning fielding crisis calls. "Rachel, we need to discuss damage control," she said without preamble. "David's arrest is going to create complications for the business that we need to address immediately." The complications were significant. Several of our major clients were expressing concern about continuing their contracts with a company whose co-founder had been arrested on federal fraud charges. Our employees were worried about job security, and our competitors were already circling like vultures, reaching out to our clients with offers to take over their accounts. "The key is transparency and decisive action," Lisa explained. "We need to make it clear that you were a victim of David's crimes, not a participant, and that the company is moving forward under new management with enhanced oversight and ethical standards." We spent the afternoon crafting a comprehensive response strategy. I would hold a press conference the next day to address the situation publicly, followed by individual meetings with our largest clients to reassure them about the company's stability and future direction. We would also implement new financial controls and bring in an independent accounting firm to audit our books and verify that all client funds had been properly managed. But the most important element of our strategy was something that had been months in the making: the expansion of Morgan Digital Solutions into a larger, more diversified operation that could survive the loss of David's involvement. I'd been quietly developing new service lines and building relationships with additional clients, anticipating that our partnership might not survive even before I'd discovered the extent of his crimes. The press conference Thursday morning was one of the most difficult things I'd ever done. Standing in front of cameras and reporters, knowing that my words would be broadcast across the region and potentially picked up by national media, I felt the weight of not just my own future, but the futures of my employees and their families. "I want to be completely clear about the situation," I began, looking directly into the cameras. "I am the victim of an elaborate fraud scheme perpetrated by my husband and his associates. I had no knowledge of their criminal activities, and I am fully cooperating with federal authorities to ensure that justice is served." The questions that followed were probing but fair. Reporters wanted to understand how I could have been unaware of criminal activities happening within my own company, and I explained the sophisticated nature of David's deception and the deliberate steps he'd taken to hide his actions from me. "The reality is that sophisticated fraudsters are experts at manipulation and concealment," I said. "They target people's trust and exploit intimate relationships to commit their crimes. I was David's wife, his business partner, and ultimately his victim. But I refuse to let his actions destroy the company that so many talented people have worked to build." The most challenging question came from a reporter who'd clearly done her homework about the case. "Mrs. Morgan, federal authorities suggest that this criminal network has been operating for several years. How can clients be confident that their accounts haven't been compromised during that time?" I'd anticipated this question and had a clear answer prepared. "We've voluntarily engaged a Big Four accounting firm to conduct a comprehensive forensic audit of all client accounts and company finances dating back 5 years. Those results will be made public, and any discrepancies will be addressed immediately. Our clients deserve complete transparency, and that's exactly what they'll receive." The response to the press conference was better than I'd dared hope. Several clients called that afternoon to express their support and confidence in my leadership. The mayor's office issued a statement praising my cooperation with federal authorities and my commitment to ethical business practices. Most importantly, not a single employee resigned, despite having numerous opportunities to jump to competitors who were actively recruiting them. But the real test came Friday afternoon, when I received a call that would prove just how far David and Amanda's criminal network had been willing to go to protect their operation. The caller identified himself as Marcus Reed, and his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. "Mrs. Morgan, I represent certain business interests that have been monitoring your situation with great concern. I believe we should meet to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to your current difficulties." I'd been expecting something like this. Agent Chen had warned me that criminal organizations often attempted to intimidate or buy off witnesses who posed threats to their operations. But the sophistication of Marcus Reed's approach surprised me. "Mr. Reed, I'm not interested in any kind of deal or arrangement. I'm cooperating fully with federal authorities, and I intend to continue doing so." His laugh was soft, but carried an undercurrent of menace. "Mrs. Morgan, I don't think you fully understand the scope of what you're dealing with. The people you're testifying against have resources and connections that extend far beyond David and Amanda's small operation. There are ways to make problems disappear, and there are ways to make people disappear." The threat was clear, even couched in euphemistic language. But rather than frightening me, it confirmed everything Agent Chen had suspected about the criminal network's reach and sophistication. I ended the call immediately and contacted the FBI to report the intimidation attempt. Agent Chen's response was swift and reassuring. "We've been expecting something like this," she said when she arrived at my house an hour later. "Reed's call actually helps our case because it demonstrates the organization's willingness to obstruct justice through witness intimidation." She explained that the FBI had been monitoring communications related to David and Amanda's network since the arrests, and they'd intercepted several discussions about how to handle the Rachel Morgan problem. The fact that they'd resorted to direct threats suggested they were becoming desperate as the federal investigation closed in on the upper levels of their organization. "We're going to provide you with protection," Agent Chen continued, "and we're going to use Reed's approach as an opportunity to gather more evidence about the network's leadership structure." The protection turned out to be more comprehensive than I'd expected. Federal marshals took up discreet positions around my house and office, while sophisticated surveillance equipment monitored my phone calls and electronic communications for additional threats. The boys were assigned protection details for their school activities, though they were told the agents were simply security consultants hired as a precaution. Within days of Marcus Reed's call, the FBI's investigation had identified him as a key figure in a money laundering operation that processed proceeds from business fraud schemes across the western United States. His call to me had been recorded and would become crucial evidence in the broader conspiracy case against the criminal network. But Reed's involvement revealed something even more disturbing about David and Amanda's operation. They hadn't just been stealing from individual businesses. They'd been feeding their proceeds into a sophisticated financial network that laundered money for various criminal enterprises. My husband hadn't just been a fraudster. He'd been part of organized crime. The revelation explained the level of surveillance I'd been under and the professional quality of their documentation fraud. This wasn't a small-time operation run by opportunistic criminals. It was a well-funded, highly organized enterprise with connections to serious criminal organizations. Agent Chen's investigation uncovered financial records showing that David and Amanda's network had processed over $15 million in stolen assets over the past 3 years. The money had been laundered through a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses that served as fronts for criminal activities. "Your case is the key to unraveling the entire operation," Agent Chen explained during one of our regular briefings. "Because you fought back and preserved evidence, we can trace money flows and communication patterns that connect dozens of seemingly unrelated crimes." The scope of the investigation continued to expand as federal authorities in other states provided evidence from their own cases. The business fraud scheme was just one component of a criminal enterprise that included identity theft, mortgage, fraud, and even human trafficking. David and Amanda had been small fish in a very large and very dangerous pond, but they'd made a critical error when they'd targeted me. Unlike their previous victims, I'd had the resources, determination, and legal representation necessary to fight back effectively. More importantly, I'd maintained detailed records that provided federal investigators with a roadmap to the entire criminal network. As October arrived and the federal case moved toward indictments, I found myself in an unexpected position. The woman who'd been fired from her own company 6 months earlier was now the key witness in one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in the Pacific Northwest's recent history. The preliminary hearings revealed the true scope of what David and Amanda had planned for my future. Documents seized from their computers showed detailed plans for my professional and personal destruction that extended far beyond simply stealing my business. They'd intended to frame me for financial crimes that would have resulted in my imprisonment, leaving David with sole custody of Alex and Jake and complete control of our assets. Amanda would have stepped into my role not just as David's business partner, but as his wife and the boy's stepmother. They'd planned to erase me from my own life as thoroughly as they'd tried to erase me from my own company. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying, but it also provided a kind of closure I hadn't expected. Every moment of doubt I'd experienced about fighting back, every question about whether I was being vindictive or unreasonable, was answered by the documentation of their systematic plan to destroy everything I'd worked to build. Agent Chen estimated that formal indictments would be issued within weeks, followed by trials that could last months. David and Amanda were being held without bail, classified as flight risks due to their connections to organized crime. Marcus, Reed, and 5 other network leaders had been arrested in coordinated raids across 3 states. But for me, the legal proceedings felt almost anticlimactic. The real victory had come months earlier when I'd walked back into my own company and reclaimed control of my life. Everything that followed was simply ensuring that justice was served and that other families wouldn't suffer the same betrayal I'd experienced. Standing in my office Friday evening, looking out at the Portland skyline as the sun set over the western hills, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine peace. The company was thriving under new leadership, my boys were safe and protected, and the criminal network that had tried to destroy us was facing the full weight of federal prosecution. David's final words to me during his arrest echoed in my memory. "The boys will never forgive you for this." But as I thought about Alex and Jake, about the kind of man their father had revealed himself to be, I knew I'd made the right choice. They deserve to grow up understanding that actions have consequences, that justice matters, and that sometimes standing up for what's right requires tremendous courage and sacrifice. The reckoning wasn't quite complete yet, but it was close. And when it finally concluded, I would be standing not as a victim of someone else's crimes, but as a survivor who'd turned her pain into purpose and her betrayal into justice. 6 months after David's arrest, the federal courthouse in downtown Portland had become as familiar to me as my own office. I'd testified in 3 separate trials, provided depositions for cases in 4 other states, and spent countless hours working with prosecutors to build the comprehensive case that would finally bring justice to all the families destroyed by this criminal network. Today was different, though. Today was David's sentencing hearing, the final chapter in a story that had begun with a simple termination meeting and evolved into the largest business fraud prosecution in Oregon's history. The morning started early, as they all had during the trial proceedings. Alex and Jake were staying with my sister Jennifer for the week, sparing them from the media attention and emotional intensity of watching their father face the consequences of his crimes. They knew the basic facts by now. David had stolen money from businesses and hurt many families, including ours. What they didn't know, and what I hoped they'd never need to know, was the full scope of his betrayal and the life he'd planned. For them, under Amanda's influence. Lisa Hayes met me in the courthouse lobby, carrying the thick briefcase that had become her constant companion throughout these proceedings. Over the months, she'd evolved from my divorce attorney into something more like a general commanding a complex legal campaign. Her strategy had been brilliant, using the civil proceedings to support the criminal cases, while ensuring that my interests and those of my children remained protected throughout the process. "How are you feeling about today?" she asked as we rode the elevator to the 15th floor where Judge Patricia Williamson's courtroom was located. "Ready for it to be over," I replied honestly. Ready to stop looking backward and start focusing on what comes next. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal agents, and representatives from the various businesses that had been victimized by David's network. I recognized several faces from earlier trials, other wives who'd discovered their husbands' betrayals, business partners who'd been systematically defrauded, employees who'd lost their jobs when companies collapsed under the weight of stolen assets. David entered through a side door, wearing the orange jumpsuit that had become his uniform since his bail had been revoked following Marcus Reed's intimidation attempts. He looked older than his 43 years, his hair graying at the temples, and his face bearing the strain of months in federal custody. When his eyes found mine across the courtroom, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no residual affection. Just a kind of detached observation, as if I were looking at a stranger whose story I'd heard, but whose fate held no emotional significance for me. Judge Williamson had a reputation for thoughtful sentencing decisions that balanced justice with rehabilitation potential. She'd presided over Amanda's trial 3 months earlier, delivering a sentence of 18 years in federal prison after Amanda's conviction on 17 counts of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Amanda had tried to claim that she'd been manipulated by David, portraying herself as another victim rather than an equal partner in their crimes. The jury hadn't been convinced, particularly after hearing recordings of her strategic discussions about targeting vulnerable families. The prosecution's presentation was comprehensive and devastating. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Davidson walked the court through David's criminal history, starting with the embezzlement from the nonprofit that Tom Bradley had discovered and continuing through the elaborate network of business takeovers that had destroyed dozens of families across 5 states. "Your Honor," Davidson said, his voice carrying the weight of months of investigation and preparation, David Morgan wasn't just a criminal. He was the architect of a systematic campaign of financial terrorism that targeted the most intimate relationships in our society. He weaponized trust, love, and family bonds to commit crimes that destroyed not just businesses, but entire ways of life for his victims. The victim impact statements were the most difficult part of the proceedings to witness. One by one, people whose lives had been shattered by David's network stood up to describe their losses. Sarah Mitchell from Seattle, whose restaurant chain had been stolen through forged documents and fraudulent transfers, talked about losing her home and having to move her 3 children into a studio apartment. Robert Kim from Spokane, whose construction company had been systematically looted over 2 years, described the depression and anxiety that had consumed him after discovering his business partner's betrayal. When my turn came to address the court, I stood slowly and looked directly at David before beginning to speak. He met my gaze without flinching, though I could see tension in his jaw and shoulders. "Your Honor, David Morgan didn't just steal my business or my financial security. He stole 15 years of my life by making me complicit in crimes I never knew I was committing. Every contract I signed, every client relationship I built, every success I celebrated was tainted by money he'd stolen from other victims. He forced me to unknowingly participate in the destruction of other families while believing I was building something legitimate and valuable." I paused, gathering my thoughts and letting the weight of those words settle in the courtroom. But more than that, he planned to frame me for his crimes. If I hadn't discovered his scheme when I did, I would be sitting where he is today, facing decades in prison for fraud I didn't commit while he raised my children with the woman who helped him destroy my life. He didn't just betray our marriage, he planned to steal my children's mother and replace her with his criminal partner. The impact of this revelation rippled through the courtroom. Even the reporters, who'd heard months of testimony about financial crimes and elaborate schemes, seemed shocked by the personal cruelty of David's plan. "I'm not asking for vengeance," I continued. "I'm asking for justice that prevents David Morgan from ever again targeting vulnerable families for financial exploitation. The sentence you impose today will determine whether other wives, other business partners, other trusting people become victims of the same systematic cruelty that nearly destroyed my family." David's attorney, an expensive defense lawyer named Richard Sterling, tried to present a picture of a man who'd made mistakes but deserved a chance at redemption. He talked about David's contributions to the medical community through his previous nonprofit work, his role as a father to twin boys, and his potential for rehabilitation if given a reasonable sentence. "Your Honor, my client accepts responsibility for his actions," Sterling said, though David had actually pled not guilty and maintained his innocence throughout the trial. "He's a first-time offender who got involved with the wrong people and made decisions he deeply regrets. A lengthy prison sentence won't serve the interests of justice or his family." But Sterling's presentation was undermined by the evidence that had emerged during the trial. David wasn't a first-time offender. He was a career criminal whose crimes had escalated in scope and sophistication over years. The wrong people he'd gotten involved with included Amanda and Marcus Reed, but the evidence showed that David had often been the initiating force in their criminal schemes. When Judge Williamson asked if David wanted to make a statement before sentencing, he stood slowly and faced the court. I expected either a defiant proclamation of innocence or a calculated plea for mercy. What I got was something far more revealing. Your Honor, I want the court to understand that I built a successful business that provided jobs for dozens of people and valuable services to the healthcare community. Everything I did was motivated by a desire to create financial security for my family and opportunities for my employees. If some of my methods were legally questionable, they were driven by noble intentions. The statement was classic David, taking credit for successes that belonged to others while minimizing his crimes as legally questionable methods. He showed no remorse for the families he'd destroyed, no acknowledgement of the systematic nature of his criminal enterprise, no recognition that his noble intentions had been to steal millions of dollars from innocent people. Judge Williamson's response was swift and pointed. Mr. Morgan, your statement confirms everything the evidence has shown about your character and your complete lack of genuine remorse for your crimes. You've had months to reflect on the harm you've caused, and you've chosen instead to continue portraying yourself as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of a criminal enterprise. She paused, consulting her notes before continuing. The evidence shows that you spent years planning and executing elaborate schemes to defraud vulnerable families. You targeted people's most intimate relationships, their marriages, their business, partnerships, their trust in the people closest to them. You weaponized love and loyalty to commit crimes that destroyed not just financial security, but fundamental faith in human relationships. Judge Williamson's voice grew stronger as she detailed the scope of David's crimes and their impact on victims across multiple states. Furthermore, your plan to frame your own wife for your crimes represents a level of callousness that defies comprehension. You were willing to send the mother of your children to prison to avoid consequences for your own actions. You planned to destroy her life, steal her freedom, and deprive your children of their mother to protect your criminal enterprise. The judge looked directly at David as she prepared to announce his sentence. David Morgan, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. You will serve this sentence consecutively with sentences imposed in related cases in Washington, Idaho, and California. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $8.7 million to victims of your criminal network. The sentence was harsher than even the prosecution had requested, reflecting Judge Williamson's assessment that David represented an ongoing danger to society if ever released. 25 years meant he wouldn't be eligible for release until he was nearly 70 years old. Alex and Jake would be adults with families of their own before their father walked free. As David was led away in shackles, he turned back toward the gallery one final time. His eyes found mine, and for a moment I thought I saw something like regret or sadness in his expression. But then his face hardened into the cold mask I'd become familiar with over the months of legal proceedings. "This isn't over, Rachel," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet courtroom. "The boys will learn the truth about what you did to their family." Judge Williamson immediately held him in contempt for the outburst, adding additional time to his sentence, but David's words had achieved their intended effect. They were a final attempt to manipulate my emotions, to make me doubt my decisions, to plant seeds of guilt that might grow over the years to come. But I felt nothing except relief that this chapter was finally closing. The aftermath of the sentencing brought an unexpected sense of lightness, as if a weight I'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted from my shoulders. Agent Chen, who'd become not just a federal investigator but something like a friend, over the months of cooperation, joined Lisa and me for lunch at a quiet restaurant near the courthouse. "The ripple effects from your case are still expanding," she told me over salad and coffee. We've opened investigations in 7 additional states based on evidence uncovered during David's prosecution. The network was even larger than we initially realized. She explained that David and Amanda's criminal enterprise had been just one node in a much larger organization that specialized in various forms of financial fraud. The business takeover scheme had been their most sophisticated operation, but they'd also been involved in mortgage fraud, identity theft, and securities manipulation. By fighting back when you did, you prevented them from perfecting their methods and expanding their operations, Agent Chen continued. If they'd successfully stolen your company and framed you for their crimes, they would have had a proven template for targeting other families with complete impunity. The knowledge that my resistance had protected other potential victims provided a sense of purpose that transcended personal vindication. This hadn't just been about recovering my company or protecting my children. It had been about stopping predators who specialized in destroying families through the exploitation of trust and love. Lisa had additional news about the civil proceedings that had run parallel to the criminal cases. The restitution orders from all the related cases will provide significant compensation for victims, she explained. But more importantly, we've established legal precedents that will make it much harder for future criminals to exploit business partnership laws and forged documentation. The changes in corporate law sparked by our case would require enhanced verification procedures for ownership transfers, mandatory independent review of partnership dissolutions, and stronger penalties for document forgery in business contexts. Future potential victims would have protections that I hadn't had when David first began his systematic betrayal. Returning to Morgan Digital Solutions that afternoon felt like coming home after a long and difficult journey. The company had not only survived the scandal surrounding David's arrest, but had actually grown stronger in the months following his departure. Our client base had expanded by 30%, largely due to referrals from existing customers who'd been impressed by our transparent handling of the crisis. Maria Santos, who'd been promoted to Chief Operating Officer after her crucial role in uncovering evidence against David and Amanda, met me in the lobby with a smile that lit up her entire face. "The final numbers are in from the third quarter," she announced. "We're up 47% over last year, and we've got enough new contracts signed to guarantee growth through next year." The success felt surreal after everything we'd been through, but it also felt earned. Every employee who'd stayed with the company during the uncertainty, every client who'd maintained their trust in our services, every vendor who'd continued working with us despite the negative publicity, they'd all made choices that reflected faith in something larger than David's individual crimes. My office had been redecorated during the months of legal proceedings, transformed from the utilitarian workspace I'd maintained during the David years into something that reflected my own aesthetic preferences and professional goals. Large windows provided views of the Willamette River and the Eastern Mountains, while artwork from local artists created an atmosphere that was both professional and welcoming. As I settled into my chair and reviewed the day's correspondence, I found an envelope marked "Personal and Confidential" that had been delivered by courier while I was at the courthouse. Inside was a handwritten letter from someone whose name I didn't recognize, but whose story was heartbreakingly familiar. "Mrs. Morgan," the letter began, "my name is Jennifer Walsh, and I live in Sacramento, California. I read about your case in the newspaper, and I think my husband might be involved. With the same people who hurt your family." Jennifer's story followed the same pattern I'd learned to recognize. A successful business built with her husband over 15 years, a new female employee who'd quickly gained influence and trust, gradual changes in business procedures, and financial controls and growing suspicions that something was fundamentally wrong. "I found your name because one of the women who worked with my husband mentioned meeting David Morgan at a business conference last year," she continued. "They talked about strategies for optimizing partnership structures in family businesses. I don't know if this means anything, but I'm scared and I don't know who else to trust." I immediately called Agent Chen, who confirmed that the Sacramento case was already under federal investigation based on intelligence developed from David's prosecution. Jennifer Walsh would soon have the support and protection she needed to expose whatever crimes were being committed against her family. But more than that, Jennifer's letter represented something important about the legacy of my own experience. By fighting back and refusing to be silenced, I'd created a roadmap that other victims could follow when they found themselves in similar situations. The knowledge that David's network had been exposed and dismantled would give future victims the courage to seek help before their lives were completely destroyed. That evening, Alex and Jake returned from their week with my sister, full of stories about school activities and weekend adventures that reminded me why all the fighting and legal proceedings had been worthwhile. They were 12 years old now, old enough to understand basic facts about their father's crimes, but young enough to recover from the trauma and build healthy relationships in the future. "Mom," Jake asked over dinner, "are you sad that Dad's going to be in prison for so long?" The question was direct and deserved an honest answer. "I'm sad that he made choices that hurt so many people," I replied carefully. "And I'm sad that those choices mean he can't be part of your lives right now. But I'm not sad that people who do bad things face consequences for their actions." Alex, always the more analytical of the twins, had his own perspective. "I think Dad forgot that families are supposed to take care of each other, not hurt each other for money." His insight was more profound than he probably realized. David had indeed forgotten, or perhaps never understood, that love and loyalty couldn't be manufactured, manipulated, or stolen. They had to be earned through consistent actions over time, and they had to be reciprocated to survive. As I tucked the boys into bed that night, I thought about the future we were building together. Morgan Digital Solutions would continue growing and evolving, providing meaningful work for our employees and valuable services for our clients. Alex and Jake would grow up understanding that integrity matters more than success, that justice sometimes requires courage, and that families defined by love rather than genetics can be stronger than those bound only by blood. The house felt peaceful in a way it hadn't for years. There were no hidden documents to discover, no suspicious phone calls to decode, no elaborate schemes to unravel. Just the quiet satisfaction of a day's work completed and a future built on honest foundations. David's final words at the courthouse echoed briefly in my memory. His promise that this isn't over, and his prediction that the boys would someday blame me for destroying their family. But looking around at the home we'd preserved, the business we'd rebuilt, and the relationships we'd strengthened through adversity, I knew he was wrong. This was over. The reckoning was complete, and what came next would be ours to build, free from the shadows of his betrayal and the weight of his crimes. The woman who'd been fired from her own company 18 months ago no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and absolutely certain that she'd made the right choices when everything depended on getting them right. Justice had been served, but more importantly, life had been reclaimed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.